national anthem. Please sit still with the perfect posture, and as we play the anthem, let's pay homage to our beloved nation. Following the anthem, it's an honor to welcome Dr. Anang Setiawan Ahmadi, the Distinguished Chief of Research Center for Ecology and Ethnobiology, who will share our opening remarks. Mr. Anang, over to you for our opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Mbak JG. Good morning, everyone. I think I will mix it with Indonesia. Selamat pagi. Salam sehat, salam sejahtera, and I think we met again in one of our agenda, research center of ecology and ethnobiology expert talk, which today we will listening I think the great information, I think the great data methodology or whatever. But first, I would like to say thank you to Dr. Paul for your time, for your I think everything that you will share to us, which is the title on your presentation. We'll choose an innovative method to measure natural capital with Arbor Cam. So I think I also curious what Arbor Cam is, but and I'm also curious about what inside Arbor Cam. I think this is also will be important, not just for me, but maybe for all participants who already attend this agenda today and this morning. And I wish maybe there will be a really nice discussions after the presentation. Also, I think mostly the participants also curious about the knowledge that you will share to us. And yeah, I think hopefully this is a good start for our collaborations with Dr. Paul, because our proposal also granted and then funded by, from the Koneksi scheme scenario between Indonesia and Australia. So I think this will be a nice step to start our collaboration, and hopefully everything will be running well for our collaboration, and also everything, all the activities that we already planned. Especially, I would like to say thank you to Pak Tomo juga, to mix with Indonesia. Pak Tomo and also the gang, the research group, one of the research group, really productive. Output the proposal and everything. I think that's for the opening speech from me. Hopefully everyone will enjoy the presentation, also the discussion. Thank you very much, and over back to you, Mbak CG. Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam. Thank you, Mr. Anand, for setting the tone for our discussions today. Now, without further ado, it's my privilege to introduce our esteemed moderator, Dr. Sutomo, representing Ecological Modeling Research Group of BRIN. He brings a wealth of experience and expertise in ecological modeling, spatial ecology, and plant conservation. Dr. Sutomo holds an extensive educational background as a PhD in Science from Edith Cowan University, Australia, and Master of Science in Plant Biology from the University of Western Australia. His current position is Chief of Ecological Modeling Research Group. He has been actively engaged in research, applying expertise in ecological science, and leveraging a diverse skill set contribute significantly to scientific endeavors and conservation efforts. Thus, he will expertly guide us to today's insightful discussion. Mr. Sutomo, over to you for our main session.
All right, thank you very much, JG. Thank you for the kind introduction. Okay, so first of all, I'd like to say my respect to Mr. Anand Ahmadi as our head of Research Center for Ecology and Ethnobiology, and also to distinguished presenter, Dr. Paul Barber, distinguished colleagues, and also fellow researchers. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to this engaging discussion on the cutting-edge innovation in remote sensing for ecology. So I am honored to welcome you all to this webinar on remote sensing for ecology. I'm truly excited to be your moderator for today's event. And we have an incredible line of experts in the field of ecology and remote sensing who will be sharing his valuable insights and experiences. As a dedicated community of scholars, you are aware of the role of remote sensing technologies in our understanding of ecosystem and species distribution. And today, in the heart of Indonesia, a region with high biodiversity, we gather to explore the transformative potential of these technologies and their applications in diverse fields such as not only for conservation and forestry, but also in agriculture and other sectors such as public health. Our country, Indonesia, presents a unique background with a rich natural heritage and complex environmental challenges. In this tropical archipelago, home to countless species and ecosystems, remote sensing holds the promise of unraveling intricate ecological puzzles. And the use of sensors, AI, and deep learning in particular has evolved as a powerful tools, which allow us to predict a dynamic responses to environmental challenge. This research topic about innovative method in measuring natural capital with remote sensing, which will be presented by our distinguished expert, Dr. Paul Barber, is a significant component of our Koneksi Grant research, which will be conducted in West Kalimantan. Koneksi is Australia's flagship program in Indonesia, which is funded by the Australian Department for Foreign Affairs and Trade for a 5-year period. The goal of the Koneksi is to create a lasting relationship between Indonesia and Australia that promotes mutual interest and supports Indonesia's inclusive and sustainable development. So before we delve into our discussion, allow me to read our presenter's CV. So Dr. Paul Barber has more than 20 years of experience as a scientist with an emphasis on the diagnosis, monitoring, and sustainable management of urban plantation, crop, and native vegetation health. He is recognized as one of the leading global experts in urban and plantation tree health management. And Dr. Paul Barber is a forest pathologist, remote sensing scientist, and founding director of Barber, specializing in the diagnosis, monitoring, and sustainable management of vegetation. Paul has developed and used novel methodologies on most continents for the precision monitoring and measurement of vegetation since 2003, including the use of high-resolution hyperspectral and airborne imagery. So since 2021, Dr. Paul Barber is also an adjunct professor at Murdoch University in Perth, Australia, involving partnership between Arbor Carbon and the Harry Butler Institute at Murdoch University. Paul also co-supervised several PhD students. So we encourage active participation from our audience here. Throughout the webinar, you can use the chat or question and answer feature to submit your questions and comments, and we will do our best to address as many as your queries as time allows. I look forward to engaging in an enriching exchange of ideas, experiences, and insight, aiming to propel the field of ecology to new heights in pursuit of a more sustainable and biodiverse planet. So terima kasih dan mari kita mulai webinar ini. Thank you and let's get this webinar started. So Paul, time and screens is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Sutomo, for the kind introduction and the opportunity to present. So Mr. Anang, for your kind introduction as well, and during as well for hosting and sharing the session. So it's great to be here. I have great connections and fond memories of my interactions over the years with various students and academics and people in Indonesia. So I'm very happy to be here to present today. I'll share my screen. Okay, so can you see my presentation?
Yes, you can.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So the title of my talk today is Innovative Methods to Measure Natural Capital with ArborCam. So just a brief background about me, I suppose, and where I've come from. Initially, my training and studies were in forest pathology. So it's quite a specialised field. I started out describing species and new species of fungi causing disease on leaves of particularly eucalypt plantations and native forests, which actually took me to Indonesia in 2004 for the first time to present a keynote in Bandung, and also travel through Sumatra looking at diseases of eucalypt plantations. After working on some complex declines of woodland trees, I discovered remote sensing in about 2003, 2004, and I saw the power of remote sensing combined with forest pathology and other suites of expertise in measuring things like natural capital. So a range of publications there, some of those with our students, former students in Indonesia who came over to work with us. Also a brief background about the company, our company Arbor Carbon. So Arbor Carbon was founded in about 2009 and has been operational now for 14 years. Back in 2012, we formed these through a strategic planning process, these four core values of our company. Partnership, so we have great partnerships with various universities and other groups throughout the world. Innovation is absolutely core in what we do and really drives us in terms of our approach and the development of our technology. High level of expertise, which is critically important to provide credibility, ensure that the science is robust. And finally, the sustainability aspect, which has been at the core of our company all the way along. So we choose to walk away from projects if there's not an element of sustainability involved in them, but we're driven by these goals. We've completed a range of projects over the years in a diverse range of fields across the globe. So they vary from a lot of work through Southeast Asia, particularly around urban forestry and plantation forestry as well, and heritage trees, sandalwood monitoring and others, through to New Zealand, all parts of Australia, South America, pre-COVID, and also North America. Not all of these projects have remote sensing involved, but many of them do. So that's a combined suite of expertise in remote sensing and in ground-based knowledge, which sets us apart from many others. We have some key partnerships with universities, including Murdoch University and University of Sydney and others. And we also have shareholding in 2 companies overseas. So one based in the UK called Barber, and another in New Zealand called Enviroland. So both of those companies utilize our ArborCam technology to acquire data across those regions. That data is pushed back to us. We process, analyze, provide reports, and provide other expertise. So it is a very useful approach for us, not having to be in all parts of the globe at the same time. I want to come back to the title of this presentation, which is about measuring natural capital. I suppose what we should first do is determine or define what natural capital is. So there are many definitions, but brief review of different websites and resources. I found this one. So natural capital is another term for the stock of renewable and non-renewable resources. So, for example, plants, animals, air, water, soils, and minerals that combine to yield a flow of benefits to people. And I think that is really core, this connection between the natural environment, natural capital, and people. And it's at the core of what we do as a company, and it drives us in terms of improving the way we measure natural capital and ensuring that there's improvements in the quality, which ultimately leads to greater benefits to the people that rely on natural capital. The depletion of a country's natural capital hinders poverty reduction and sustainable development objectives. So that, again, that is key. So we must conserve and improve natural capital. It's becoming more and more critical as time goes on, as we continue to lose our natural capital, and it's having a huge impact on many countries throughout the world. Understanding the value of a country's environmental assets is the key to sustainable development and economic growth. So we must understand the value of natural capital if we are going to sustainably develop and ensure there is economic growth. And to do that, so sustainable management and reliable valuation of natural capital requires accurate and precise methods of measurement. And those words there are my words. So that's what I believe, and I'll talk a bit about that today in terms of how we measure natural capital. So you can't really manage something well or value it unless you're measuring it accurately, and that's really critical. So pushing into the topic, which is really around innovative remote sensing methods or Earth observation, I wanted to provide a brief introduction. This is a very, very brief introduction and overview. So there are many resources that you can utilise to delve further, but in brief, so basically with remote sensing or Earth observation, we have a platform, and the platform is the device or your system for carrying the sensors. So, for example, here we can vary from satellites, all types of satellites, down to crewed aircraft. So things like planes and helicopters, down to then UAVs or UASs or unmanned or uncrewed airborne systems, or drones as people often refer to them. So these are devices that carry the sensors, and these are the platforms. Then we have the sensors themselves, and the sensors can vary from active sensors, so those emitting pulses of energy like LiDAR, for example, or radar. And then there are passive sensors. So these are sensors that are measuring, for example, the energy that is coming from the sun bouncing off the material or the natural capital that we're looking to measure. These sensors work across a wide range of wide range of the electromagnetic spectrum. So you look down into the UV or the visible, then near infrared, the thermal, and then we go off into the microwave region. We typically, in the work that we do, we're working in this visible to near infrared region, and then off in the thermal region, which is the long wave. There's also a short wave region. So typically where we're operating with the Arbicam, we're operating in these regions with our sensors. Apologies. So then we have spatial resolution, which is very, very important with remote sensing. So you can see some examples here of varying spatial resolution. So in this example here, we can see variation from approximately 6.5 meter spatial resolution, pixel size, right across to 208 meters in this pixel size. So you can very quickly see, if you're looking to measure natural capital, as you get lower resolution imagery, you start to get mixed pixels, and we have less or decreased ability to differentiate between the different types of natural capital that we're looking to measure. So the choice of the sensor and the platform and that combination, which drives the spatial resolution, is really critical to what you're going to be able to measure, and that's defined by your ultimate objective in terms of what is the end game, where do you want to be. When we're working with the Arbicam, we tend to be working at a much higher resolution than what you see here, which is typically satellite resolution. So with the Arbicam, we can be working at anywhere from 0.015 meter GSD, which is approximately 1.5 centimeter pixels. So typically what you'd expect from a low-level UAV or drone, but we're operating at higher altitudes with the crewed aircraft. And then you can see the varying spatial resolution as we modify the Arbicam or change the altitude of the aircraft. We operate sometimes up to 2 meters GSD at much higher altitudes with different sensors, depending on what we're trying to achieve. So often we don't need this level of resolution. That just simply adds to the amount of data and the amount of cost that we're looking to, that we have in a project. So we modify and produce data with much lower resolutions if required, but never in this sort of region, always much higher than this spatial resolution. And then we also have spectral resolution. You see this example on the left-hand side here. So basically they have a sensor here that acquires data across different regions of the electromagnetic spectrum. In this example, there are 7 bands of data. That's what we call bands of data across these regions. We can combine those different bands and make different algorithms and what we call spectral vegetation indices to measure particular types of natural capital. In this example here, they've combined the blue, the green, and the red bands, typical in the visible region of the spectrum. That would typically be used to combine to produce a true color orthomosaic. They're showing here, though, this is what we refer to as a false color orthomosaic. That doesn't typically combine these 3 bands. It usually is the near infrared band, the red, and the green to produce this false color composite. We can see that the spectral reflectance and the signatures of different types of material and natural capital, they vary widely. So in this example down here, you can see the reflectance being measured from a sensor. You see the reflectance of water. You see the reflectance of soil across the visible, then the near infrared region, and off into the shortwave, the mid-infrared. And then you also see the typical signature of green vegetation. So big differences between these different types of substrates. And so if you're using sensors with 3 or 4 broad bands, quite easy to distinguish between these different types of natural capital. When we want to do more sophisticated analysis and start to differentiate between, for example, different species of tree like this, and these are the spectral signatures from these different species of tree, we see that those spectral signatures are much more closely aligned with subtle differences between them. So the broad bands in the visible region, just in this visible region, simply just won't be enough to differentiate between these different species. What we're going to need is much narrower bands in this visible region, but also off into this red edge, near infrared and beyond. And that's very important. So that's when multispectral data or narrowband multispectral data and hyperspectral data really comes into its own, being able to differentiate species like this. We mustn't forget artificial intelligence, and Dr. Stomo mentioned earlier about artificial intelligence and deep learning. There's increasingly a lot of conversation around AI. We've been using AI now in remote sensing for a long time. But what is artificial intelligence? So basically, it's the ability of machines to perform tasks typically associated with human intelligence, such as learning and problem solving. In remote sensing, it is not new. So, for example, we've been using artificial intelligence, machine learning being a form of AI, going back to the late 2000s and publishing some of that work in 2012, so over a decade ago now, using those methods for measuring natural capital and vegetation. Machine learning and deep learning are simply examples of AI. And what is the ultimate goal with this? Well, it's really around removing the subjectivity in our measurements and increasing the efficiencies of doing so. And that's really key for what we want to do with remote sensing, particularly when we want to scale our approach and measure natural capital across large areas. And there tends to be a high-level process in this. So we're basically acquiring the data, we're preparing it, we're creating training data, we're then training the data, and we have this feedback here loop, moving to inference and then deriving the products and then finally taking action. And that's what we'll be doing in our Connexi project as that commences. So what is the ArborCam? And that's what I'm here to talk about today. So identified years ago that there was a gap in the data that was being acquired for the measurement of vegetation, and particularly vegetation in the urban forests and in cities. Many people were using, for example, LiDAR to try and measure trees and tree canopy. But LiDAR doesn't give you the spectral information that's required to measure things like condition or health of vegetation or differentiate species. There's also been a lot of use of satellite data and AI, but satellite data has a lot of its own issues around parallax, tree lean, and the lower spatial resolution, minimizing the ability to differentiate between different height classes of vegetation or different types of vegetation. Or measure within the subtree level. So the other one is UAVs and drones, but in urban areas, they are often there's often restrictions around using them, and they can't scale across whole cities very, very easily. So we developed, conceptualized ArborCam about 6 years ago for the purpose of developing a system to undertake remote sensing of vegetation. So building, designing, and from the ground up for that purpose. Many other cameras are mapping cameras, and they're being used, or there's a value add to measure things like natural capital. We commenced operations with the system about 5 years ago now. First client was the City of Melbourne, and they really are leaders in the urban forestry space. The thing about ArborCam, one of the things that makes it unique is it has these 11 bands of data, a range of narrow and broad bands. So our narrow bands of data are down at the sort of 10 nanometer full width half max, which is very narrow, and it allows us to differentiate between different types of natural capital and species over and above what can be done with broadband cameras. The bands span the visible, the near infrared, the red edge, and the long wave infrared, and the resolution varies. We produce 3D sort of imagery, so we're talking about point clouds and surface models, and we do that without the use of LiDAR. So through a photogrammetry approach or a structure from motion approach. We can modify the crewed aircraft in altitude, which often allows us to modify the resolution for a range of reasons, but anywhere from about 1,000 feet to 20,000 feet above ground level. And all the flight planning, acquisition, processing, analysis, and reporting is undertaken by our team internally, with the exception of pilots and aircraft, although we have trained pilots now, and we do have an aircraft release in Western Australia. So with the ArborCam, we then provide very detailed information on the vertical and horizontal structure of vegetation, spectral and thermal information, and these are key for object identification and deriving metrics, which I'll show you of natural capital. In addition to that, which is very important, is the suite of expertise we have in our team, which is complementary to the remote sensing. So these are in the fields of forest pathology, forest inventory, urban forestry, arboriculture, soil science, ecology, and even strategy and policy. So that's very important because it enables us to make that connection between the science, the data, and actually being able to use it well on the ground. So providing managers with those tools to easily use the data that's been derived. And that's often been a challenge in remote sensing, where people have been inundated with data, but they haven't been able to utilise it for the purposes that they require. We strongly believe also that if you are going to provide remote sensing tools and data, they have to be have these range of attributes, and so we've developed this acronym RADARS. So it must be reliable, and that has to be through extensive and ongoing field validation to ensure that what it can do is true, what it's measuring is true on the ground, but also being able to use it remotely in different regions. In challenging environments, and that's very important with the ArborCam. It must be accurate, so we're required by some of our clients to undertake accuracy measures of the data through statisticians, and we regularly, each time we do that, we're hitting these sort of 97, 98% accuracy of the height strata and what we produce as measures of natural capital, which really, again, sets us apart from many others, and we work very hard to get that level of accuracy. It must be defendable, so it has to have a high amount of or high scientific rigor, supported by a range of publications and research. But in many cases, we don't publish the research. Most of our work is carried out for our clients, and often may be sensitive in nature, so it's not published. But in some cases, we can publish, and we find the time to publish data, particularly through projects with students and supervising students utilising our data. It must be affordable. That's really important. So if it's not affordable, then people just won't use it. And we often find that our data, particularly at the high altitudes, is more affordable than even the highest resolution satellite data. So even though it's from a crewed aircraft. Must be repeatable, so any monitoring system that you use must be able to measure change over time when you're looking at natural capital. There's no point having just a single point in time that is powerful as a baseline, but you must be able to measure that over time so that temporal change and look at how your management is impacting the natural capital over time. And finally, it must be scalable. So no point, measuring a single 100 hectare lots if we're looking at measuring natural capital across large areas. So it must be scalable across hundreds of square kilometres per day if possible. That's very important. So a point of difference between ArborCam and other systems like LiDAR and satellites. Do we generate 3D point clouds? Yes, we do. Unlike LiDAR, we're not able to penetrate through the crown and see understory and ground layers that may be beneath the canopy. That's a limitation of Arbocam. But yes, we can produce very dense, detailed point clouds, and often much more detailed than what you can do with LiDAR systems. And often with satellite systems, you're unable to produce these types of point clouds. Concurrent to doing that, we also pick up optical data. So, for example, sub 10 centimeter GSD optical data. That's often not the case with LiDAR, and with satellites, they're not down at that resolution yet. So we're able to, more often than not, our data is collected at this resolution. We have a focus on vegetation. That's really key with our system. And with LiDAR really came about as more of an engineering tool, and has been used for things like measuring tree structure. Sometimes with satellites, they're targeting vegetation. Can we discriminate tree species and genera? Yes, we can. We've had several projects now, particularly around the biosecurity space, doing that. With LiDAR, that's very, very difficult, because you just don't have the spectral information that you require to do that sort of work, which is really, really important. In satellites, in some instances, you may be able to do that with much larger trees. It gets very difficult when you're talking smaller trees and shrubs. And we also, this is a very important one, as far as pathologists, we're very focused on the health and condition of vegetation, not just whether it's present or the size of it. And through those different spectral vegetation indices, we're able to derive these measures of condition, whereas with LiDAR, because it's not utilising spectral information required to do that, you can't. And with satellite, down at the individual tree level, can be very difficult due to the limitations around spatial resolution. We turn the data around very quickly, and that's very important, as our clients need the data very quickly. It needs to be current, and lots of analytics around vegetation and natural capital. So the image you see there is a global image, and the green dots you see are just some areas where we've acquired Arbocam data sets. So we have those data sets loaded up on our UI, and they are a range of different areas where natural capital occurs. So, for example, over here, kauri forests in New Zealand, we have cities here, mangroves, we have natural forests and native forests, mine sites, sandalwood, a whole range. Over here we have soybeans and eucalypts and sugarcane and pivot. So a whole range of different substrates we've acquired data over across the globe over the years. So moving into some examples of the measurement of natural capital, particularly vegetation in different environments. So as I mentioned earlier, we've done a lot of work throughout cities and urban areas. These are simply figures straight out of some of our reports showing some of the outputs of from Arbocam. So you see here a true colour orthomosaic in the top left, a false colour composite, a digital surface model, a thermal infrared image, which is the surface temperatures in the urban environment, very important data to collect, particularly around the urban heat island effect. The vegetation condition index, or in this instance, it's NDVI. Most people know NDVI as a spectral vegetation index, but we don't tend to use it very often. It's not the best index. We have others derived from Arbocam that are much more sensitive and more useful than NDVI. And then being able to do things like delineate building footprints, differentiate between what's vegetation and not vegetation, and then the different height classes, and then between what is grass or turf and shrubs, for example. So really granular detail. Not only just the images, but the really important part of the metrics. So if we're wanting to benchmark a suburb or a city, we can derive the metrics from each of those areas, and we can look at different land use categories, land tenures, private versus public, commercial versus residential, for example. So all of that data can be derived and is derived as part of our client for a service for our clients, particularly around their urban forest strategies and greening plans. So another example here. So this project across the city of Sydney in 2018, 2019, we've acquired Arbocam data. And then we've derived the different layers and then the metrics for just this area, for example. So this is basically a clipped out area and then showing the composition of the site. This is very important when we're benchmarking natural capital. In this instance, you can see also areas where we're differentiating between everything that's canopy. So what you're seeing here is clipped out. Everything below 3 meters in level is not being shown. So the grass, for example, is not being shown. We've basically clipped that out. So we're looking at canopy here. And then what we're seeing in the pink is rooftop vegetation. So green roofs. And this is something we did for City of Sydney outside scope because we could do it from our data. And this is a very important measure. They have teams working on green roofs and as do the City of Melbourne. Very important part of the data that we derive from Arbicam. We're able to detect vegetation, for example, in strong shadows. And that's due to the spectral sensitivity and radiometric resolution of the sensors that we use. We see these pieces of vegetation in big cities like this are very important. So in many cases, when you look at images of cities or mapping images or airborne imagery, buildings will be on the lean, and that's due to a parallax effect, whereas you'll see with our data, we're always looking straight down on top of the building, or we're looking straight down on top of the trees. And that's very important when you're undertaking remote sensing of vegetation. If we move across to other areas, again, we can see every piece of vegetation picked up with Arbicam. And then we can see turf throughout the area differentiated from all the other vegetation that's below 3 meters in height. Okay, so providing these very accurate measures, which enables us to do a great deal for our clients when it comes to measuring the performance of natural capital over time. If we zoom in on that type of data, so what you're seeing here is data from 8 centimeter pixels from the aircraft. So typically we can acquire data across a city area within a couple of hours and then have that data at this resolution. You can see the split screen here. So on the left-hand side, you see the true color orthomosaic. On the right-hand side, you see the height strata and the vegetation detected through a combination of a range of different analysis methods, but using AI as well to differentiate turf from what's not turf. Very important part here that you see is although the synthetic turf or the artificial grass here, which is green, may be picked up in optical sensors that are less sensitive than ours as grass, real grass, but we differentiate that because of the sensors and the process we use with Arbicam. And you can see the tightness of the delineation around the tree crowns, which we've worked really hard on to produce that level of accuracy with the Arbicam data. Moving beyond what we call the standard deliverables outside of Arbicam, or coming out of Arbicam, so height stratified vegetation cover, vegetation condition index, and the surface temperatures or the thermal, they tend to be our standard deliverables. And beyond that, we also produce a range of other measures. So in this instance, what you're seeing is an AI developed approach to delineate every crown within this city area above 3 meters in height. So if we can delineate each of those crowns, we now have information such as tree counts, tree sizes. We can derive metrics for each of those crowns. So for example, we can have the crown area, the tree height for that tree. We can have the mean condition derived from the vegetation condition index. We can have temperatures. We can start to derive other things like biomass or above ground biomass, carbon. So a lot of projects where we're utilising our approach like this to derive a range of metrics for our clients for managing their urban forest or managing their plantations or their natural capital, for example. Benchmarking tree condition, as I mentioned, is critically important. So a lot of people talk about the number of trees being planted, or they talk about the canopy cover across the city, but not a lot of people are talking about the health or the condition of the trees. So no point planting trees or trying to conserve canopy if you're not actually managing the health or condition of your vegetation, which is really, really important. That's something that we specialise in. From the ArborCam, we can derive numerous or dozens of different spectral vegetation indices from those narrow bands that we have. And this is one that we call the Vegetation Condition Index, very, very sensitive to any variation in the reflectance coming off the vegetation. We can see through these turfed areas on these golf courses what would typically be seen as a uniform looking piece of grass in a visible region in our vegetation condition index, showing it's highly variable, and it can be for a range of reasons. So we use this data at every individual pixel. Once we have this data, we can start to hone in on problem areas throughout a city, and that's what we can use combined with our tree crown delineation. So in this example you see on the left-hand side, this was a project for biosecurity response to a particular borer or pest that had come into Australia, impacting urban trees and a potential threat to move out of the urban area into horticulture and plantation forestry. So it's trying to be contained. So looking at a rapid response to detect where this pest might be impacting the health of trees and then monitor the change over time. And we've just won a national award for this, for the best use of technology with this local government. Left-hand side, you see the Vegetation Condition Index layer. So every pixel varies in its reflectance, the higher reflectance in the purple that you see, down through to the lower reflectance in the red. And so we see trees of varying levels of reflectance even within the crown. And then what we do is, once we've delineated the crowns of the trees above 3 meters in height, we can extract the mean value of that index, and then we can benchmark the tree condition. So what we're interested in doing is moving away from a ground-based subjective approach to more of an airborne technology approach that is benchmarking the condition of trees, very much a quantitative objective approach to doing that, which is very important if you're going to scale and be able to utilize resources well on the grounds. Very important to see that in these different quartiles, we've got the mean value of the VCI measure. And if these trees were the same species, we could benchmark the condition. And so we have the ones in the red in the lowest quartile and those in the green in the highest quartile, for example. But different species will have different measures of the VCI. And that goes back to that spectral signature graph that I showed you earlier with the different species. So very important also to know the species, because it may not be that there's just a variation in condition between these trees. It may simply be that these are different species and they have a different VCI layer. So we need to be benchmarking trees within a species. And you can see that here, these different species here, much lower in their VCI to these species here. So that's very important to understand. Surface temperatures are also very important to measure, particularly in the urban environment, but also this measure can be impacted through factors by factors that impact uptake of water in trees, for example. So it could be drought stress, it could be a pathogen impacting water uptake or causing wilt, or it could be borers, for example. So we're very interested in measuring that vegetation condition. In this example, it's the urban heat island effect. So targeting where to plant trees, looking at the impact of the hardscapes on surface temperatures. So this is all about improving the livability of cities. And as climate change impacts the varying temperatures across cities and they start to heat up over time, this has a big impact on the well-being of people that rely upon those cities, particularly nighttime temperatures. That's very important. So we undertake daytime and nighttime work. I mentioned earlier that we have some of our students also utilize our ArborCam data for various projects. This is an example. So Dr. Tu Nguyen completed her PhD in 2022, and she looked at the cooling benefits of golf courses through urban areas. She utilised a range of satellite data, so Planet, for example, and Landsat data, but also our Arbicam data. You can see the example of our Arbicam data on the left-hand side here. So you can see the big temperature differences between a natural turfed court here and a synthetic court on the left-hand side. So really big differences in those temperatures. What two did is derive the metrics of different height classes of vegetation and different types of vegetation and non-vegetation to show the cooling benefits of larger trees in the urban environment. So the greater cooling benefits, very important message there around retaining those trees and managing the health of those trees over time. Two also looked at the different types of landscape patterns. So, for example, this morphological spatial pattern analysis to derive factors like fragmentation through the urban environment, and then looked at the temperatures of those as well. And so she published this work in remote sensing last year, and now too is working. She was working in local government in the urban forestry space, and now is working for state government in the sort of climate change area. We're also looking at things like buildings and dwellings. So this is very important in the urban environment. Being able to delineate those dwellings, the heights of those dwellings and areas of them, using Arbicam data and AI to do that. So really current, often cities and local governments and state governments are reliant upon data that may be several years old, but this is very current. So that's been a piece of work that we've adopted, and also it's very important in the planning or urban planning space. There's been some discussion as well around measuring species, so using remote sensing. So we've had a couple of projects now, particularly in the biosecurity space, measuring vegetation, as you've seen previously, but also looking at whether we could detect where particular species of tree are in the urban environment using Arbicam data. So this is an example of a project, again, looking at these sentinel trees. So sentinel trees are trees that are monitored throughout the urban area, so close to ports, so where shipping containers might be coming in from overseas. Biosecurity surveillance officers will go around on the ground and look for particular tree species that are known to be potential hosts of pests or pathogens coming in through port. And if those trees have the pest or pathogen, it can be an early detection method to eradicate prior to moving out into horticulture or agriculture or forestry, for example. In this case, we're looking for pine and plane trees, and we were asked if we could detect where these trees were through the urban environment. The alternative approach is simply driving around looking for them. But if trees are sitting in the backyards of private homes, it's very difficult to see those trees, or you would have to knock on the door of every single house. It's very time consuming. So this is about rapid response to any incursions. And in this project, we developed an artificial intelligence approach, a deep learning model, actually a couple of different deep learning models, to see if we could detect pine and plane trees. And we achieved an accuracy with this approach of 92% and 95% with plane trees, which was a great outcome for our client, because they wanted anything over 75% would be beneficial to them. So this work was published this year in Urban Forestry and Urban Greening. The loss of natural capital, as I mentioned earlier, is very concerning, and it continues to be a big issue. So we need to measure that. If we don't measure that loss over time, then we can't alert people to the fact that it is occurring, how much of it's being lost, and then obviously do something about it. So in this instance, we've looked at the loss of canopy over a 5-year period in this local government, and all the red areas there you see loss of canopy after we've analysed the Arbicam data with the original baseline data that they acquired. And you can see it's extensive. So it may not be apparent from normal imagery, but when you show it like this, it's very apparent. So mostly this is due to urban development and changing in zoning laws in these urban areas. So a large loss in natural capital, which also has an impact on the well-being of people in these environments. Change detection is really critical, and this is something that we'll be looking to do, hopefully, in the Connexi project. So what we're looking at here is the change in the VCI over a 12-month period. On the left-hand side, you see a very high-resolution image, 1.5 centimetre spatial resolution acquired from the crewed aircraft. On the right-hand side, what you see is the change, the 12-month change in that vegetation condition index. So the white layers are stable over that 12-month period. The blue pixels increase in that condition, that VCI layer, which in this instance is the change from flowering of those jacaranda trees, which are purple in colour, through to green the following year. So that's a change in the phenology. And the red is what we're really concerned about, which is the loss in the VCI. So every red pixel you see there is a decrease in that vegetation condition index signal. And that can be for any reason, but it alerts us to something that's occurred on the ground. So in this instance here, pruning of this tree, over here, urban development, and then we can have small pieces of pruning even at the sub-tree level. So given it's 1.5 centimetre pixels, we can get loss of shrubs and also just declining condition due to factors like impact to root systems or the borer or pathogens. Very important to know how we can improve natural capital as well. So that's knowing where to plant trees. And so we have developed methods for determining where the planting spaces are, how many trees can be planted, what potential size they can get to over time, and what sort of canopy can be achieved. So these sorts of data sets and layers are very important as a guide. Again, it's streamlining approaches. It's enabling people to have less boots on the ground and making it easier for them to plan ahead and achieve realistic targets going forward based on real data. In some cases, we want to find where there might be dead wood or standing trees of dead wood or deciduous trees in an environment. So this could be the case in natural environments as well, or we might be looking for breeding habitat for particular marsupials that might like hollows in trees or dead wood within crowns. So we've developed, again, using ArborCam data and some deep learning models to detect where that wood would be and the size of that. So that's what you see with those yellow boxes. That's basically labelled each of those trees that have either dead wood or no foliage on their crown, and the size of the box indicates the size of that wood that we've detected. This is an airborne image from the Waipua forest in Northland in New Zealand, looking at measuring kauri dieback, and the kauri trees up there, some of them over 2,000 years old, magnificent sort of ecosystems and magnificent natural capital through here. These trees are being threatened by some very serious root pathogens or Phytophthora species coming in and impacting the health of these trees. So in this instance, you see a high-resolution true colour orthomosaic from the ArborCam, and you can clearly see the diversity of species in the forest, and you can see some very large trees with dead wood in their crowns. What we're interested in through ArborCam, what we can do is measure every piece of vegetation above a certain height, so we can change these height classes, but we're looking at, okay, show us and quantify the amount of vegetation above a certain height class, and now you can see through that data where all the foliage is being retained on the crowns of these trees. We can quantify that as well. The vegetation condition index, which is a little bit like the NDVI that I mentioned earlier, that also is used in the high reflectance in the purple and the lower reflectance in the red, with a scale in between. Here you can see those sick trees, or the trees that are lower in the VCI, jumping out here. That may warrant some attention on the ground, so we can monitor the health or change in health over time, which is very important. And then we can delineate the crowns of these trees and derive the metrics from the ArborCam data. So again, these are very challenging environments to work in the field. Walking out to get to these trees in the forest is just challenging in itself, and a little bit like many of the forests will be in parts of Southeast Asia and the tropical and subtropical forests. Then once you get there, being able to measure the actual crown, so the amount of foliage in the crown, the health of the crown, a very, very time-consuming process, very difficult, very and really subjective measures. In this case, we're using Arbicam data to quantify that at a scale in this forest, which is over 9,000 hectares. These trees are very important. So this site here is a car park where people go to visit these trees, and over 120,000 people per year go to just visit a single tree in this forest. We're not just confined to forests or cities or plantations as well. We do a lot of work in coastal areas, nearshore environments. So what you're seeing here is a small area that we've acquired with the Arbicam. We processed up some of that data as a true colour orthomosaic. But what you see on the right-hand side there is the vegetation condition index layer. So even that VCI layer is able to not only pick up coastal vegetation, even algae that occurs on the rocks. So not even just terrestrial vegetation, but the algae that's growing on the rocks here, it'll pick up that signal. It's very sensitive to that. Here you see areas of seagrass and salt marsh and mangroves. So we've got, again, data from Arbicam, and this data is being acquired, being able to penetrate through the water and pick up the seagrass that occurs on the shore, on the floor of the sea. Some of this work we'll be hoping to do in the Connexi project as well, in parts of West Kalimantan. So this Connexi project, as Dr. Tomo mentioned earlier, it's an exciting project. So we'll be mobilising Arbicam to West Kalimantan. It was meant to happen late this year, but it's been delayed. And so what we'll be doing is waiting for the monsoon season to finish, and then we'll be starting in April, May next year. And the goal is to acquire up to 40,000 hectares of Arbicam data from a resolution of 5 centimetres pixels, so very, very high resolution, and working with a range of stakeholders, including BRIN, to derive measures and validate that data on the ground, and then also utilise an urban user interface to engage in that data easily, which is something else we've done over the years. We're very excited about this project. It's a very high-profile project, and we're very excited about commencing that project and getting Arbicam into the country. So just in summary, artificial intelligence, so AI and Earth observation, in my opinion, must play a key role in natural capital measures. It's really critical, and it's the only way we're going to scale and get the measures we need and be able to manage natural capital well. Spatial and spectral resolution are absolutely key to the accuracy of the measures of natural capital. So we've seen examples there of satellite data, which can be very useful, particularly at the landscape scale. But if we really want high accuracy, scalable, there are other approaches to doing that, as I've shown some of those today. The quality of the outputs and success depends on many factors, including the quality and type of data acquired. And not only that, but the expertise of the people undertaking the analysis. So it's not good enough just to acquire the data. It must go far beyond that. And that requires not only remote sensing technicians, people can undertake geospatial analysis, but also people with expertise of natural capital in trees and what that means on the ground. That's really, really important. And there's lots of companies and groups sort of starting up, lots of startups, lots of people talking about satellite and AI being backed with, by various, venture capitalists and so on. It's really important when you're assessing or hearing claims about the ability to measure natural capital at the press of a button, or being able to replace teams of people in the field, which I often hear. It's really important that you assess the accuracy of the claims being made, get some examples of the data, and ask about the field validation and look at the track record of these groups. It's very important as well. So I'd like to say thank you very much. Terima kasih banyak. If you'd like to reach out to me in the future, please feel free to do so at email. But I really thank you all for your attendance today and listening to my presentation. I look forward to some robust and interesting discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. So it's very interesting that the Arbor Camp can do so much in terms of ecological research. In terms of our works in a Research Center for Ecology and Ethnobiology, I think it will very much help us in doing this work. So what I'm very impressed is that Arbor can differentiate up until species level. Also, it can differentiate habitus, not just trees, but also ground cover as well. And it has also a highest thermal resolution up until 1 meter, which is a Landsat only 100 meters. So it's interesting aspect that we can use for our works. So before that, with respect to our esteemed audience, please feel free to post your questions directly to Mr. Paul Barber, or you can write to the chat column in this Zoom meeting. So yeah, probably Mbak JG sudah ada yang bertanya di kolom chat.
Ya, saya udah tampilkan itu, Mas. You can see at the share screen
Yes, okay.
the Q&A session.
Yeah, we have Mr. Hadi Saputra. Would you like to ask direct to Paul, or should I read it to you?
Yeah, thank you, Paul, about your presentation. I want to ask about how this carbon can identify the numbers of species in the Indonesian primary forest, because we know about this, the density of the trees in the area. So can this application identify, maybe you can identify the number of species or the dominant species that cover the area like that. And the second question about can we access the image result from this camp, maybe for research purpose? Because my doctoral thesis is about the deep learning using this satellite image. So maybe I can get the access for the image. Thank you.
Thank you, Hadi, for your great question. So I suppose I must make the point initially that we haven't acquired any data yet of the primary forests in Indonesia, but we're hoping to do so very soon. So that hopefully will commence in April, May next year. So that that will happen going forward. How do we identify the individual trees and species? So as you've seen in that presentation, so the process is we acquire the data from Arbicam, raw data. We pre-process and process that data to produce those range of outputs, which vary from the height classes of the vegetation, which can help us to differentiate trees and different heights of trees, within a forest like you have in Indonesia. We then can utilize the spectral data. So there's bunch of narrow bands and broad bands that we have in the data. We can look at a whole range of different combinations of those. Those different species of trees will have different spectral signatures, so we can utilize that to differentiate between different species of tree. Now, it's not just that, but it's also the size of the tree, the shape of the tree, the architecture. They're very unique. So you can imagine what a palm tree looks like compared to a fig tree. Very, very different in architecture, although they may be the same color or spectral vegetation index or spectral signature, which they're probably not, but they could be, for example. So that architecture is very important as well. So we utilize all of that to then define what is a tree, how many trees there are. We have to delineate the tree crowns before we can then get those species to a reasonable level, and that will how close those trees are and their signatures will define whether we can do that with Arbicam. It may be that we can't with some trees. Maybe some trees are the difference between a very healthy tree of a single species to a very sick tree of a single species is greater than the difference between two different species, so it makes it difficult. So, there's a lot of learnings from previous projects and our knowledge of trees on the ground that we utilize. yes, they look uniform in color in the visible region, but they may be very, very different when we get out to the red edge, the near infrared, and also in the long wave. How can you access the image results? So for research purposes, so we would hope going forward, that the collaborations that we build through Connexi and potentially with Brin outside of Connexi and others, that we can build that collaboration and we would access the data through that approach. So typically it's, when we're accessing it, it's usually through the user interface, logging onto that, downloading those data sets, and then being able to utilize those for research purposes. So that's the case. I hope that helps.
Okay, thank you.
This is the next question, Mr. Paul, from Dr. Indra Januar.
Fantastic. Excellent. I suspect some of these questions may have been asked prior to me presenting some examples in the talk. So I didn't talk about the coastal environment until towards the end. Yes, the approach extends into shallow waters in the coastal regions, such as coral reefs, seagrass, kelp beds, and so on. And so we've had several projects now, particularly around seagrass and kelp, project coming up looking at kelp beds and the impact of organisms eating that kelp. So yes, because we can penetrate through the water. Now, it may require some modification to ArborCam. So the nice thing about ArborCam is we can modify the filters that we use and the bands that we acquire. So some of the bands in the near infrared region may not be very suitable for penetrating and seeing through water, as that band in the electromagnetic spectrum is strongly absorbed by water. So therefore, we may be able to have additional bands in the blue or the green region that may help us to penetrate through the water and see the substrate and what we're looking to measure at that natural capital. Is it possible to differentiate between healthy, damaged, and dead coral reefs? We haven't had a project yet actually looking at coral reefs, but we know based on all the other work we do and our understanding of the science around coral reefs, absolutely. So I would strongly suspect we'd be able to do that and do that quite well. So we've had some projects which are the learnings from those being able to do things like remove the glint from the surface of the water so we can penetrate through and see beneath, and we've done that and developed methods to remove the glint. So those methods can be then transferred across to being able to measure things like coral. Yes, and discerning differences between coral reefs and other communities like seagrass and algae, I suspect so. I suspect we could do that. I can't say for sure because we haven't had a project where we've looked to do that yet, but knowing the science, knowing my knowledge in remote sensing and ArborCam, I suspect we'd have a strong chance of being able to do that with a high level of accuracy.
Okay, the next is question from Dr. Eko Pujono. So it's great presentation, Dr. Paul. As you said, ArborCam is affordable and more cost-effective than LiDAR. How much it costs per hectare for taking aerial imagery and then further analyze for individual tree delineation or carbon biomass assessment or forest health, surface temperature, and perhaps this information will be a benefit cost consideration for parties who will use the ArborCam.
Yeah, great question, Eko. Thanks very much. So it varies widely depending on the project. There are many factors that come into play when we're talking about costs. So, for example, the cost is driven by distance from base, so mobilising the aircraft to the project area, the time to acquire the data, which is dictated by the size of the area and also the resolution. So then the amount of data that we acquire and have to process. All these factors impact the cost per hectare. Cost per hectare can vary. The larger the area and the lower the resolution, the lower the cost typically. So we might get down to somewhere, around the, 1 to 2 Australian dollars per hectare for producing our standard deliverables, up to several $100 per hectare, depending on those factors I discussed earlier. Then further analysis to do things like tree delineations, carbon, forest health, surface temperatures. Surface temperatures are standard deliverables, but those other ones, and forest health, the VCI, again, a standard deliverable as part of that cost per hectare. The additional AI analyses like tree delineation, carbon assessments, they are added on, and again, driven by, the level of work and the level of detail and processing required to do that. So very hard to give a cost estimate here on that, but yes, they are additional costs. And yes, this is always drives our discussions with our clients. And so over the years, we've worked very, very hard on producing a product from end to end that is affordable, and we need to work within the budgets of our clients and partners. And so that's very much critical. And so our knowledge of what's required, the derivatives required and what the objectives are, then we can go back and think about, the way we acquire the data, the resolution we need, the type of analysis that's required to make it affordable. So that's, again, built up through experience over time, and it's critical to them and to us. And if we don't produce an affordable product, that's also what's critical about this is it's not only affordable, but it works. So we're not simply just providing data, and often that may be the case that people will try and save money by getting satellite data, or try and save money by getting some other type of data, maybe aerial photography or 4-band data, but then not getting the required outcome, which will cost them more in the long run. So we work very closely with them to find a mutually beneficial solution.
Yes, and then next questions from, who is it from? JG?
Okay, so I suspect so. So again, not something that we've done really, I suppose. So can we use ArborChem to assess the vulnerability of tree species in relation to the classification? So yeah, I'd probably have to take that one on notice. But yeah, I can't probably really comment on that at the moment. So we haven't done that again in our work. So if we're talking about trade, which I suspect we are, maybe you can expand on that question, Agus, to expand on that, and maybe I can try and answer that for you.
Pak Agus, bisa didetailkan lagi pertanyaannya?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to ask you that your system is to evaluate the vegetation in the cityscape. Yeah, a lot of examples in the cityscape, like in Melbourne and the other cities, big cities. And now in the natural state, can we use the I think that the arbor relates to arboriculture, like the trees, yeah, not the forest. So can you apply this system to assess the scarcity or vulnerability of tree species in relation to the CITES or UCN classification? Because many people argue that the CITES and UCN is not accurate to assess the scarcity or the vulnerability of the certain species in respective countries. So this, I think, is very important to use this system. Let's say like agarwood to assess the the vulnerability agar wood in Indonesia, can we use this or whatever the species? Paul, very important for CITES and UCN. And the second is you mentioned that the NDVI is not accurate system to assess the vegetation monitoring. In Indonesia, we use this system NDVI. So what is your suggestion to replace or to change the NDVI for in terms of accuracy, cost-effective system to measure the vegetation in Indonesia? That's my questions to you, Paul. Good day.
Thank you, Agus.
Thank you, Marcus.
Yeah. So in terms of being able to measure the abundance or vulnerability of different species in the natural forest, so yes, I mean, Arbor does refer to is arboriculture as a component in the urban area, but Arbor really is just tree. So we've got lots of projects in natural forests, plantation forest, urban. It varies, you know. So lots of projects in natural forests. So one of the things that we do is identify particular species in the natural forest, and that's some of the work we'll be doing in New Zealand. And so, yes, if you're wanting to find particular species like agarwood or other species and the abundance of them, the number of them, ArborCam's perfectly set up to do that. So because it has the spatial resolution and the spectral resolution that's required to do so, whereas a lot of the satellite data that may be available may not have the spatial or spectral resolution required to differentiate, you know, individual trees in stands of, you know, large stands of complex, you know, ranges of species, particularly native subtropical species in native forest. When it comes to NDVI, so when I mentioned NDVI earlier, I just said that it's not the best index, particularly for us. So we have a range of different indices that we use. NDVI is the most well-known, and it's been used and it's derived out of satellite data, so moderate low resolution satellite imagery, you know, going back decades, particularly in forestry. It's a greenness index, really. When you're starting to get down to individual tree levels, you know, we find NDVI is not the best measure. So we have, you know, the vegetation condition index and others that we use. We have to factor in things like shadows, which obviously have a big impact on these measures. So we can do things like mask out shadow and just measure the sunlight being reflected off the crown. So I would say, look, you know, there's a range of different indices, you know, you could look at. So there's NDVI, of course, and there's Takari and Savvy and a bunch of other indices, lots and lots of them out there. You just have to work out what is the best for your application, bearing in mind that NDVI often oversaturates, particularly in vegetation that has a very strong green signal. So there may be others that will assist you to get better measures in Indonesia.
Thank you, Paul.
No worries.
Good day.
Thank you.
Yeah. Is there any question again from Ms. Nida Humaida, Paul? Ms. Nida, would you like to ask direct to Paul? So one of her research interests is in urban heat island. And she usually uses thermal image from Landsat 8, which only has 100 meter resolution. So seeing your ArborCam tools has 1 meter thermal resolution is most tempting. So is it possible for ArborCam to also detect evapotranspiration from the trees?
So thank you, Nida, for that question. So what we can do with ArborCam, because we have such high resolution data, we can extract data at the individual crown level, and we can extract data on the shady portion of the crown and the sunlit portion of the crown as well. There's a range of different indices that relate to the water being taken up in the tree, and that can be derived from the thermal sensor. So yes, it's something that we're actively exploring, is the ability to benchmark the health of trees using the thermal sensor, but also the performance of different species of tree in urban environments in hot conditions. So this is a key question, because if we're going to have cities that are drying and heating up over time, and weather conditions and climate conditions are changing, we're going to have species that are resilient to those changes over time, particularly new species being planted. So it's something that we're undertaking, working at the moment. Thank you.
I think we have one more question from Professor Acep. So related to the problem of forest fire, vegetation under forest stands such as grass and bushes is the cause of initial ignition in forest and land fires. Is there a possibility that an arbor cam could be used to detect bottom vegetation as the fine fuel, Paul?
It's a good question. So one of the limitations of ArborCam is not being able to penetrate through the ground, unlike LiDAR, for example, that can do that. So we're unable to measure, leaf litter on the ground or anything that's building up beneath the crown of the tree. But we can measure that, start to get measures of that outside of the crown, so areas where we can see that. We've had some projects where we've developed some fire risk ratings using ArborCam derived data in combination with more traditional methods. So again, trying to move away from these older ground-based methods, which are very time-consuming and point sampling, to using ArborCam data, which can derive measures like things like slope and aspect, connectivity of the crown, dryness of the crown, all factors that can play a key role in ignition and spread of fire over time. So there are applications for ArborCam for fire, assessing fire risk.
Yeah, I hope this answer your question, Professor Acep.
Thank you. I think it's clear.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Also, Paul, ArborCam can discriminate up until genus and species level, which is fantastic. This means monitoring of invasive alien species such as Acacia nilotica as well as other species can be done very easily. But what about carbon measurement between two different ecosystems, such as blue carbon in mangrove with carbon in savanna? So can ArborCam do this kind of research works?
Yes, so we have a PhD student at the moment working on, well, actually two students working on blue carbon in seagrass using ArborCam and other data sets, and also they've done some work in salt marsh as well. So we have had research projects and continue to have research projects in this space. And obviously in the terrestrial vegetation space, we've completed a range of projects in that area, and we continue to do so. So I suppose our interest is also, firstly, yes, so we can use ArborCam across different ecosystems to derive above ground biomass and carbon. And our interest in that space is really moving away from very coarse resolution or very lower accuracy models for measuring carbon or estimating carbon, to deriving that at the individual tree level or individual high resolution level we can do with ArborCam. So really improving the accuracy, the precision of those measures over time, and that's therefore brings integrity to the measures of carbon, which is really key for us. That's what really drives us in our work.
Yeah, very interesting. What about the application in agriculture, Paul? I saw in your presentation that the arbor carbon can be used to take forest health, which you once used in detection of phytophthora pests. What about in agriculture, like paddy rice field? Can we detect leaf blight disease or something like that with ArborCam?
Yeah, so we haven't had any projects in the rice at the moment to date, but based on some of our work that we've undertaken on areas like sugarcane, soybeans, different sort of areas of canola. We see a huge application for Arbicam in those areas, particularly in the pest and disease space, because we understand that space very well. With rice, I would be optimistic that we could pick up some of those leaf blight and other diseases of rice, particularly if we had a sufficient resolution and acquired the data at the right time, which is really critical to this as well. The key thing about this type of data is you can pick up those impacts from the pathogens prior to being able to see them in the field with your naked eye, because we're seeing the response of the vegetation, and we're picking up bands in the red edged and non-visible region, and also the thermal, which can be very important. So I'd be optimistic with rice. We haven't done a lot of work in the agriculture space, purely because we've been so busy focused on trees and other ecosystems, natural capital, partly also because it's a very, very busy space. There's a lot of tech out there. There's a lot of startups. There's a lot of noise around drones and satellite and AI. And I think there's a lot of spin as well. So we just chosen not to go down that path, put a lot of effort into that area, but we see huge applications in the agriculture space for our data.
Yeah. And we have the next question from Masyayan. Masyayan, could you ask directly to Mr. Paul?
Okay, Mas Tomo, thank you. Thank you, Paul. That's very powerful application of our you presented. My question, that spectral data we use to analyze multi-species is also provided by, ICWS loh, Mas. Halo?
Monggo, Mas Yayan.
Tomo. This is a very powerful application of Arbocam. But relating to our big agenda in tropical rainforest with big number of species with high density, as Mr. Hadi and Mr. Agus said, that maybe we need more spectral data of multi-species. Is that provided automatically when we operate Arbocam, or it is a different resources we have to get and then running together with Arbocam? Thank you.
Thank you, Yayan. Excellent question. So typically what happens is we acquire the data, produce the standard deliverables, and have those derivatives, but then there's additional work that's required to delineate the tree crowns, to develop the models, to detect and differentiate different species. What is really important with that is the identity or identification of those species, and ideally there's some data on the ground. If you have locations of trees on the ground, and you have the more replicates you have of those different species, the better, and we can use that information to then train models and then test them and validate them going forward. And that's what we did in that example with the pine and the plane trees that you saw. So we'd adopted a slightly or a similar approach in the forest in Indonesia to do that. So really ideally you have that information on the ground to help develop those models, but once they've been developed, then future acquisitions, we should be able to fly over and acquire and identify where those species are in the future with a reasonable level of accuracy.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Terima kasih, Mas Tom.
All good, Mr. Masyayan?
Yeah, it's good. Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. Is there any question from the audience? Probably from me, Paul, because our research center is not only ecology research center, but also ethnobotany, ethnobiology research center. So how does Arbocam can be used in terms of ethnobiology research works?
We haven't really had a lot of projects in that space again, Tomo. So we'd have to have specific examples. You could ask me, hey, do you have an example, for example, or a situation that you'd like to, a case study that in mind that you'd like to refer to that I can, that I can talk to in the ethnobiology.
Yes, perhaps like potential use of several kind of plants in medicinal treatment or something like that for the indigenous knowledge people. Well, I think this also can be done in West Kalimantan that the Connexity grant will do.
Yeah, okay. So we have the projects in New Zealand working with the Maori and iwi groups in New Zealand, so First Nations groups in that part of the world. So there's a huge amount of knowledge on the grounds there of those ecosystems and the natural capital areas. So we're working closely with them to derive the metrics that will help them to manage the natural capital and the asset, but also not only that, to help them engage in the data easily. I see often there's a real challenge around being able to access really good data. So particularly around Indigenous groups and First Nations people having access to really good quality metrics that may be acquired by government or acquired by other parties. That data can be quite difficult to access and utilize, or if they do access, quite difficult to derive meaningful metrics from it for management. That's what we are working really hard on, is working with those Indigenous communities, those First Nations groups, to enable that to happen. And that's what will happen in the Connexity project as well. It's actually a key part of the project is being able to train up, but also develop a platform that they can engage in the data easily. So we're excited by that. It's a really key part, of this piece of work.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Paul. So so there are several questions that in terms of ArborCam, how much is it, Paul, to cost to rent or to use this technology?
We don't typically rent or sell or the system itself, so we tend to just operate the system, and that then comes down to that question earlier around the cost per hectare. So that cost per hectare is driven by mobilizing to site and acquiring data. I suppose what we see in the future with Connexity having aircraft within country doing work is the ability to also value add on that, to be able to do other work, but also hopefully build the capacity in Southeast Asia to have ArborCams based there rather than have to mobilize back and forward from Australia. So this is a model that we've approached in Europe and also in New Zealand and South America, having ArborCams sitting there, having people trained up to operate the ArborCam, having aircraft there, rather than us having to travel back and forward all the time to operate the camera system, particularly if we're acquiring data across large areas. That could be months and months of acquisition time, and that would be better to have people in country that can do that. So that's the approach, and that will hopefully assist everyone going forward, particularly in Indonesia.
Yeah. So it's the capacity building that is more important. So
yeah, capacity building, absolutely. And there's no reason why in the future that we couldn't sort of license our technology to people or to groups, to utilize in the future as well. So all those, those options are there.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Paul Barber, for the insightful discussion today. I would like to extend my gratitude to all participants who has already asked questions, and also to watch this expert talk today. So next I will hand it to JK.
Thank you so much. Well, as we conclude today's enlightening session, I want to extend our sincere appreciation to Dr. Anas Setiawan Ahmadi, our moderator, Dr. Sutomo, our keynote speaker, Dr. Paul Barber, our distinguished guests, and each one of you for your active participation and valuable insights shared during this discussion. Before we part ways, I'd like to remind you all about an exciting event coming up next week. It's our genuine session where we will delve into ecological modeling as the baseline of sustainable development in smaller islands in facing the pressures of climate change. Here's a sneak peek. Save the date and join us next week for an engaging and insightful gathering. Remember to fill out the attendance form to receive your e-certificate for today's session. We value your feedback and look forward to seeing you next time. Until then, keep exploring, keep learning, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you very much,
Assalamualaikum
Paul.
warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you.